Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin tonight with a claim that will unsettle almost every headline you have read this week. The ceasefire that Washington is parading as a triumph of American mediation is not an American victory at all. It is, in fact, the precise strategic configuration that Beijing and Moscow have been patiently engineering for the better part of 3 years. What you are being sold as a pause in hostilities is actually the moment the chessboard tilted, and the hand that tilted it was not the hand holding the pen at the signing table. Most of what you are hearing right now is theater. The real movement happened underneath it. And tonight, I am going to walk you through the structural reality beneath this ceasefire, not the headline about it. By the time we finish, you will see why Jiang Zemin's old doctrine of strategic patience has just produced its most elegant dividend, and why the United States has mistaken a containment trap for a diplomatic win. Let me pull the lens back because the framing matters more than the facts right now. When American networks describe this ceasefire, they describe it as if Washington is the author, the broker, and the guarantor. That framing is not merely incomplete. It is structurally misleading. A ceasefire is not a victory. A ceasefire is a freeze. And a freeze only benefits whichever party has the most to gain from time itself. The question you should be asking is not who signed the agreement. The question you should be asking is who benefits from the clock now running forward under these exact terms. Because in geopolitics, the party that controls tempo controls outcome. And tempo right now is no longer in American hands. Here's my thesis, stated plainly so there is no confusion. The ceasefire America thinks it controls has just become the standoff that China and Russia wanted all along, because it locks in 3 things simultaneously. It freezes territorial realities on terms favorable to Moscow, it exhausts Western political will under the illusion of resolution, and it frees Chinese strategic bandwidth to concentrate on the Pacific theater without the distraction of a hot European war. Washington believes it has paused a conflict. In reality, it has completed a containment architecture against itself. That is the hidden structure, and that is what I want to prove to you carefully, layer by layer, over the next 12 minutes. Let us begin with the immediate reality, because you cannot understand the structural game without first seeing the surface accurately. On the surface, the ceasefire terms appear balanced. There is a line of contact. There are monitoring provisions. There is language about future negotiations, security guarantees, and phased reconstruction. The American administration is presenting this as a diplomatic breakthrough, a vindication of sustained pressure, a demonstration that Western resolve forced Moscow to the table. That is the story. Now let me show you what the story omits. First, the territorial language. The exact words matter here, and I want you to pay attention because this is where most commentary is failing you. The ceasefire does not restore any pre-war boundary. It does not commit either party to territorial withdrawal. It uses the phrase current lines of administration, which is diplomatic code for de facto recognition of seized territory without the political cost of de jure recognition. That is not a compromise. That is a concession dressed in procedural language. Moscow gets to keep what it took, and Washington gets to claim it did not formally acknowledge the taking. Both sides walk away with a press release. Only one side walks away with land. Second, the enforcement architecture. There is no NATO guarantor mechanism with teeth. There is no automatic trigger for renewed sanctions if the ceasefire collapses. There is instead a vague consultative framework that requires consensus among parties who will never reach consensus. That means the ceasefire is structurally self-perpetuating in Moscow's favor because any violation can be contested, delayed, relitigated, and ultimately absorbed into a new normal. This is what I call a ratchet freeze. The line only moves one direction and it never moves back. Third, and this is the piece almost no one is discussing, the economic reintegration clauses. Buried in the secondary provisions is language permitting phased sanctions relief tied to compliance benchmarks. Compliance benchmarks that are by design unverifiable, which means Russian energy flows quietly resume, European dependency quietly reestablishes itself, and the entire sanctions architecture that took 3 years to build begins dissolving within 18 months. Washington does not see this yet because Washington is reading the front page of the agreement. Beijing and Moscow wrote the footnotes. Now let me walk you through the structural explanation because this is where the analysis has to deepen. The real question is not what this ceasefire does. The real question is what this ceasefire enables. And to answer that, we have to understand the 3-theater logic that has governed Chinese and Russian grand strategy since roughly 2021. The 3-theater logic works like this. The United States, as the incumbent hegemon, has finite strategic bandwidth. It can credibly commit to roughly two major theaters simultaneously, and even that strains its industrial base, its deterrent credibility, and its domestic political consensus. The three theaters that matter are Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. The Sino-Russian Strategic Understanding, which is not a formal alliance but a tacit coordination, has been built around a simple principle. Keep the United States stretched across all three, force it to prioritize, and then exploit whichever theater it deprioritizes. For 3 years, the European theater consumed American attention, American munitions, American political capital, and American fiscal bandwidth. That was useful to Beijing in the short term because it drained the arsenal, but a hot war in Europe also carried a tail risk that Beijing did not want, which is escalation into a broader NATO-Russia confrontation that could pull in Chinese dependencies, disrupt Chinese energy imports, and force Beijing into premature alignment. So the Chinese strategic preference shifted sometime in late 2024 toward freezing the European theater rather than continuing to bleed it. A frozen Europe is more useful to Beijing than a burning Europe. And this ceasefire delivers exactly that. Most people miss this inflection point, so let me state it clearly. Beijing wanted this ceasefire. Beijing signaled through back channels and through its diplomatic posture with European intermediaries that it would support terms favorable to Moscow in exchange for Moscow accepting a freeze rather than pushing for further advances. Moscow, exhausted and increasingly dependent on Chinese industrial inputs, accepted. The ceasefire is, in effect, a Sino-Russian coordinated exit from a theater that had served its purpose. And the purpose it served was to drain the American arsenal, fracture European political will, and fix American strategic attention eastward while Beijing consolidated its position in the Pacific. Let us pull the lens back even further because the historical pattern here is instructive, and it is a pattern that American strategic culture has repeatedly failed to recognize. I want to walk you through 3 historical rhythms that map almost exactly onto what is happening right now. The first rhythm is the Korean Armistice of 1953. Washington celebrated that armistice as a containment victory. The fighting stopped. The line held. American prestige was, on the surface, preserved. But what the armistice actually did was freeze a divided peninsula in a configuration that allowed the Soviet Union and the newly consolidated People's Republic of China to redirect resources toward other theaters, most immediately Indochina. The armistice did not end the strategic competition. It simply relocated it, and within 2 years the French were collapsing at Dien Bien Phu, and within a decade the United States was drawn into Vietnam. A ceasefire in one theater almost always funds escalation in another. That is the rhythm. The money, the attention, the industrial capacity all migrate. They do not disappear. The second rhythm is the 1938 Munich settlement. I invoke this one carefully because the analogy is not about appeasement in the moral sense. It is about the structural error of mistaking a pause for a resolution. Chamberlain believed he had secured peace. What he had actually secured was time for the adversary to consolidate, rearm, and redirect. The structural mistake was identical to the one Washington is making now. When you freeze a conflict on terms that allow the revisionist power to retain its gains and recover its capacity, you are not ending the conflict. You are funding its next phase. And the next phase always arrives on terms less favorable to you than the terms you just accepted. The third rhythm, and this is the one that applies most directly, is the 1979 Sino-Soviet split and the subsequent American strategic misreading of it. Washington spent a generation believing it had played China against Russia through Nixon's opening. In reality, the Sino-Soviet relationship was always tactical, not ideological, and by the 2010s it had reconstituted itself in a new form, a form tailored precisely to exploit American assumptions about their permanent estrangement. The lesson is this: American strategic culture consistently underestimates the capacity of adversaries to coordinate when coordination serves their interest, and consistently overestimates the durability of divisions it finds convenient. The current ceasefire is being celebrated in Washington precisely because it flatters American assumptions. That is always the moment to be most suspicious. Now let me expand the scope because this ceasefire does not exist in isolation. It is one move in a sequence, and to understand what comes next, we have to see the sequence whole. Let me walk you through this carefully. Move 1 was the exhaustion of Western munition stockpiles. That is now complete. American 155mm production, even after 3 years of emergency expansion, remains below peacetime Russian production. European stockpiles are worse. The industrial base that would be needed to sustain a second major conflict simply does not exist, and rebuilding it is a 10-year project, not a 10-month project. Move 2 was the fracturing of European political consensus. That is now visible in every major European capital. The political parties that rose on the back of war fatigue, energy costs, and immigration pressures are now in or near government across the continent. The European political will to sustain confrontation with Moscow has been hollowed out from within, and this ceasefire formalizes that hollowing. Move 3, which is beginning now, is the reorientation of American strategic attention toward the Pacific under conditions where the tools of deterrence have been materially degraded. Washington will pivot to Asia. It has been trying to pivot to Asia for 15 years, but it will pivot with an arsenal depleted, an industrial base strained, a European flank frozen rather than secured, and a Middle Eastern theater that continues to demand attention. This is the configuration Beijing has been patiently building toward, not a war. A standoff in which the American deterrent is visibly insufficient to the task it is asked to perform. Move 4, which is the one to watch in the next 18 months, is the testing of that insufficiency, not through a Taiwan invasion. That remains too costly and too uncertain. But through graduated pressure, expanded gray zone operations in the South China Sea, intensified economic coercion of Pacific partners, deeper penetration of Latin American and African supply chains, and most importantly, the quiet construction of a parallel financial architecture that renders American sanctions increasingly irrelevant. The ceasefire in Europe is what frees Chinese bandwidth for all of this. So what does this mean? Let me tell you what I think it means, and then let me tell you what I think it demands of us as people who are trying to see clearly. What it means is that we are entering the phase of the great power competition in which the illusion of stability is more dangerous than the reality of conflict. A frozen war in Europe, a managed tension in the Middle East, a slow-motion encroachment in the Pacific. None of these will produce the kind of crisis that focuses the Western public mind, and that is precisely why they are so dangerous. The adversary who understands that your political system cannot sustain attention without crisis will engineer exactly the absence of crisis. He will give you calm, and in the calm, he will take everything he needs. The civilizational warning I want to leave you with is this. Democratic societies have a structural weakness, and that weakness is the requirement for visible threats to sustain strategic discipline. Authoritarian rivals understand this better than we do. They have learned that the most effective way to defeat a democracy is not to attack it, but to bore it. To give it ceasefires, agreements, summits, photo opportunities, and the slow hollowing of its material position beneath the surface of apparent peace. That is the game being played right now. And Washington, by celebrating this ceasefire as a victory, has just announced that it does not understand the game. Let me close with the turn because I want you to leave this analysis with something actionable, not just something unsettling. Here's what to watch in the coming months. Watch the footnotes of the ceasefire, not the headlines. Watch the sanctions relief timeline because that is where Russian economic reconstitution will be visible. Watch Chinese naval activity in the South China Sea and around Taiwan because that is where the reallocated bandwidth will manifest. Watch European defense spending because if it falls rather than rises in the next 12 months, you will know the continent has accepted the freeze as permanent. Watch American industrial policy because the true measure of whether Washington understands what has just happened will be whether it treats this ceasefire as a breathing space for rearmament or as a return to normalcy. If it is the latter, the next phase of the competition is already lost. And watch, above all, the language. The exact words matter. When officials begin describing this ceasefire as durable, as stabilizing, as a foundation for cooperation, you will know the framing has succeeded and the strategic reality has been obscured. When independent voices begin describing it as a freeze, a pause, a tactical retreat, you will know the analysis is catching up to the truth. The intellectual duty here is not pessimism, it is clarity. It is the refusal to accept comforting narratives when the structural evidence points elsewhere. It is the willingness to say out loud that the emperor's ceasefire has no close, even when every network and every capital is applauding the parade. History does not reward the nations that told themselves the most flattering stories. It rewards the nations that saw the board as it actually was and moved accordingly. This ceasefire is not the end of a war. It is the beginning of a standoff. And the standoff has been configured patiently and deliberately by adversaries who understood something Washington has not yet understood. That in the long competition between civilizations, the decisive advantage does not go to the power that wins the loudest battle. It goes to the power that most accurately reads the silence after it. I am Professor Policy Insights. Keep your eyes on the footnotes. Keep your mind on the pattern. And keep your nation, whichever nation you call home, honest about what it is actually seeing. Because the cost of seeing clearly is discomfort. The cost of not seeing clearly is everything.